The New Mexico wind carried the scent of sage and coming rain across Samuel Garrett's ranch, but he barely noticed as he hammered another loose board back into place on the corral fence. At 53, he'd grown accustomed to the endless cycle of repair and maintenance that kept a man's hands busy while his mind wandered through territories better left unexplored. The fence would hold for another season, maybe two, which was about as far ahead as Samuel allowed himself to plan these days. 8 years had passed since fever took Martha and their unborn child, leaving Samuel alone on 600 acres of high desert that stretched from the Sangre de Cristo foothills to the Rio Grande Valley. Good land. Martha had always said, land worth fighting for, worth building dreams on. Now it felt more like a monument to those dreams, a place where memories lived in every corner of the house and echoed in every room that had once been filled with laughter and hope. The ranch had prospered in those early years when Samuel and Martha worked side by side, building something lasting from nothing but determination and the kind of love that made even the hardest labor feel like privilege. They'd planned for children, for grandchildren, for generations that would carry on their work and expand their legacy. The small room off the kitchen still held the cradle Samuel had carved from pine lumber, still waited for the babies that would never fill it. These days, Samuel kept fewer cattle, tended smaller fields, maintained only what was necessary for survival rather than prosperity. The hired hands had drifted away years ago, finding work on spreads where the owner's heart was still in the business of building rather than merely enduring. Samuel preferred the solitude anyway. Company required conversation, and conversation inevitably led to questions about plans he didn't have and futures he couldn't imagine. As the sun settled toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that would have taken Martha's breath away, Samuel completed his circuit of the barn and outbuildings. Everything was secure for the night. The animals fed and watered. The gates latched against coyotes and the occasional mountain lion that wandered down from the high country in search of easy prey. He was heading toward the house when he heard it, a sound so soft he might have missed it if the evening wind hadn't chosen that moment to die away completely. A rustling from inside the barn, followed by what sounded like a quiet sob, quickly stifled. Samuel paused, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle he carried during his evening rounds. In 8 years of solitary living, he'd never had anyone hide in his barn, but these were troubled times in the territory. Apache bands still raided settlements when government rations failed to arrive on schedule, and there were always desperate men willing to steal horses or cattle from isolated ranches where help was days away. But as he approached the barn door, listening carefully to the sounds from within, Samuel realized this wasn't the noise of men preparing for violence. It was something else entirely, the careful, controlled breathing of someone trying very hard not to be discovered, the kind of frightened quiet that came from people who had learned that survival depended on invisibility. Samuel opened the barn door slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior lit only by the last rays of sunlight filtering through gaps in the wooden walls. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Hay bales stacked against the far wall, his remaining horses in their stalls, tools hanging from pegs Martha had insisted he install to keep things organized. Then movement caught his eye in the far corner, behind the largest pile of hay. A figure huddled in the shadows, wrapped in what looked like a cavalry blanket that had seen better days. As Samuel stepped closer, the figure looked up, and he found himself staring into the face of a young Apache woman whose dark eyes held depths of exhaustion and fear that made his chest tighten with recognition. She was perhaps 25, with the high cheekbones and strong features that marked her heritage, her long black hair braided but disheveled from travel. Her clothes were dusty and torn, speaking of hard riding and harder hiding, and in her arms she clutched a bundle that moved slightly with the rhythm of infant breathing. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the dim space of the barn, the aging rancher with his graying hair and weathered hands, and the young mother whose presence in his barn could bring the kind of trouble that ended with graves being dug in unmarked ground. Samuel knew he should order her to leave, should point her toward the territorial road, and wish her luck finding safety somewhere that wasn't his responsibility. Instead, he found himself thinking about Martha, about the child they'd lost, about the cradle that still waited empty in the room off their kitchen. "Ma'am," Samuel said quietly, setting his rifle aside and raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You hurt." The woman shook her head slightly, but Samuel could see the exhaustion in every line of her body, the way she held herself with the careful tension of someone who had been running for too long and wasn't sure she could run much farther. "Baby sick?" Samuel asked, nodding toward the bundle in her arms. Again, she shook her head, but this time Samuel caught the quick flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, the mother's constant worry that translated across any language or cultural boundary. "I'm not going to hurt you," Samuel said, stepping back to give her space while keeping his voice low and steady. "And I'm not going to turn you into anyone. But if you need help, food, water, a safe place of rest, I can provide that." The woman studied his face with the intensity of someone whose life depended on reading the intentions of strangers, looking for signs of deception or hidden threats. Whatever she saw in Samuel's expression seemed to reassure her, because some of the tension left her shoulders and she shifted the baby to a more comfortable position. "Soldiers," she said finally, her English accented but clear. "They came to our camp. Said we were off the reservation, without permission. My husband—" She stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. Samuel felt the familiar weight of injustice settle in his stomach. He'd heard the stories, seen the aftermath of incidents, where military patrols decided that Apache families traveling legally were actually hostile raiders who needed to be dealt with decisively. The newspapers called it maintaining order on the frontier, but Samuel had seen enough to know that order often came at the cost of innocent lives. "You can stay here tonight," Samuel said, making the decision without fully considering its implications. "Barn's warm. Got plenty of hay for bedding. I'll bring you food and water." The woman's eyes filled with tears she was too proud to let fall. "Why?" she asked. "White men, they do not help Apache mothers." Samuel looked at the bundle in her arms, thinking about his own lost child, about Martha's dreams of motherhood that had died with her in their bed upstairs. "Maybe because some things are more important than the color of a person's skin," he said quietly. "Maybe because a baby's a baby, regardless of who birthed it." As darkness settled over the ranch and Samuel prepared to become an accomplice to whatever crime the territorial government might decide harboring Apache refugees represented, he felt something stir in his chest that had been dormant for 8 years. The possibility that some purposes were worth the risks they demanded, that some choices mattered more than the safety they might cost. Samuel returned to Barn an hour later, carrying a wooden tray laden with warm bread, beans cooked with salt pork, and a pitcher of fresh milk from his best cow. The Apache woman had made herself a nest in the hay, the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms while she kept watch on the barn door with the vigilance of someone who understood that safety was always temporary. "I brought enough for several meals," Samuel said, setting the tray within easy reach but maintaining respectful distance. "Milk's fresh, bread's from this morning's baking." The woman accepted the food with a nod of gratitude, eating slowly despite what was obviously considerable hunger. She shared small pieces of bread with the baby, who couldn't have been more than 6 months old and who regarded Samuel with the solemn attention that very young children sometimes showed strangers. "What's the baby's name?" Samuel asked, settling onto a hay bale where he could keep watch on the barn entrance while giving the woman space to eat in relative comfort. "Little Fox," she replied, smoothing the child's dark hair with gentle fingers. "He is, how do you say, curious about everything, always watching, always learning." Samuel smiled despite the gravity of their situation. "Good name for him. What about you? What should I call you?" The woman hesitated, clearly weighing the risks of revealing her identity against the courtesy of proper introduction. "I am called Morning Star," she said finally, "daughter of Chief Running Bear of the Mescalero Apache." Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach as he recognized the name. Running Bear was one of the more prominent Apache leaders, a man who had signed treaties with the territorial government and generally maintained peaceful relations with white settlements. If Morning Star was his daughter, then whatever had happened to drive her into hiding was likely far more serious than a simple misunderstanding about reservation boundaries. "Your father's a respected man," Samuel said carefully. "If you're his daughter, why aren't you under his protection?" Morning Star's face darkened with grief and anger carefully controlled. "Because my father believes the soldiers lies about what happened to our hunting party. Because the officer who killed my husband told him that I ran away rather than face justice for crimes I did not commit. The pieces began falling into place in Samuel's mind, a common enough story in the territory, where ambitious officers sometimes manufactured incidents to justify promotions, or where genuine misunderstandings escalated into tragedies that left families destroyed and communities divided. What really happened? Samuel asked. Morning Star shifted Little Fox to her other arm, her movements careful and economical as she arranged her story in English words that could carry the weight of her experience. My husband took permission to hunt elk in the high country, away from the reservation, but legal under the treaty. We followed old trails, camped in places our people have used for generations. She paused, studying Samuel's face for signs of judgment or disbelief. Finding neither, she continued. Lieutenant Morrison came with 20 soldiers, said we were raiding white settlements, said we had stolen cattle. My husband showed him the hunting permit, the papers from the Indian agent. The lieutenant said the papers were forgeries. Samuel had heard Morrison's name before, a young officer with political ambitions who had made his reputation pursuing Apache hostiles with what the newspapers called admirable zeal. The kind of man who saw every Apache outside the reservation as a potential threat, and every successful encounter as another step toward advancement. Morrison shot him. Morning Star continued, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly as she held her son. Shot him while he was showing the papers. Said he was reaching for a weapon, then told the other soldiers to say my husband had attacked him first. And you ran. I ran. With my son. Through country I know better than any white soldier. But Morrison told my father that I had murdered white settlers, that my husband died trying to protect me from justice. My own father believes I am a killer. Samuel absorbed this information, understanding that he was now harboring someone who was officially a fugitive, someone whose capture would bring Morrison considerable credit and whose death would be a small footnote in the territorial newspapers. You could go to the Indian agent, Samuel suggested. Tell him your side of the story. Morning Star's laugh was bitter as desert wind. The agent who takes bribes from Lieutenant Morrison? The agent who profits from selling rations meant for Apache families? He would turn me over to the soldiers before I finished speaking. Samuel had no answer to that, because they both knew she was right. Corruption ran deep in the territorial administration, and Apache complaints against white officials rarely received serious consideration from authorities who found it easier to maintain order by siding with their own people regardless of facts. Then what's your plan? Samuel asked. You can't hide in my barn forever. I have relatives among the Chiricahua across the border in Mexico. Morning Star said. If I can reach them, Little Fox will be safe, and perhaps in time the truth about my husband's death will emerge. That's 300 miles of desert, and most of it watched by cavalry patrols looking for exactly someone like you. I know, Morning Star said simply, but it is the only path that leads to life for my son. Samuel found himself thinking about paths and choices, about the difference between survival and living, about the kinds of decisions that define what a man was willing to stand for when standing up carried costs he couldn't calculate. Maybe there's another way, he said finally. What way? Samuel wasn't sure himself, but as he looked at Morning Star holding her child with the fierce protectiveness that transcended any boundary between cultures, he felt something awakening in his chest that had been dormant since Martha's death. The possibility that some causes were worth fighting for, that some people deserve protection regardless of the risks involved. Let me think on it, Samuel said, rising from the hay bale. In the meantime, you're safe here. I'll bring you breakfast in the morning, and we'll figure out what comes next. As he walked back toward the house under a sky full of stars that seemed closer than usual, Samuel realized that for the first time in 8 years, he was looking forward to tomorrow. Not because it promised ease or comfort, but because it promised a chance to be useful, to matter in ways that went beyond the simple maintenance of property and the preservation of routines that had kept him alive but not truly living. Tomorrow would bring challenges he couldn't yet imagine, but tonight, knowing that a mother and child were safe in his barn, Samuel Garrett felt more like the man Martha had married than he had since the day he'd buried her dreams along with her body. Samuel woke before sunrise to the sound of hoofbeats approaching across the desert. Not the casual rhythm of a single rider, but the organized clatter of multiple horses moving in formation. He dressed quickly and grabbed his rifle, reaching the front window just as a cavalry patrol crested the rise that overlooked his ranch. 20 men in military blue, riding in a column that spoke of official business rather than social calls. At their head rode Lieutenant Morrison himself, a young man whose carefully maintained mustache and spotless uniform spoke of someone more concerned with appearance than practicality. Even at distance, Samuel could see the confidence at his shoulders, the bearing of someone who expected immediate compliance with whatever demands he might make. Samuel's first instinct was to check the barn, to ensure that Morning Star and Little Fox were well hidden among the hay bales where discovery would mean death for them and serious legal trouble for himself. But movement at the window would only draw attention, and besides, Morning Star had survived 3 days of pursuit by demonstrating remarkable skill at avoiding detection. The patrol approached the house in standard formation, with Morrison and his sergeant taking the lead, while the remaining soldiers positioned themselves to control all approaches. Samuel recognized the tactics from his own military service during the war between the states. The careful choreography of men who expected resistance and were prepared to deal with it decisively. Samuel Garrett. Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. By order of territorial command, open your door for official inspection. Samuel stepped onto his porch, rifle held casually but visibly, projecting the kind of calm readiness that came from years of living alone in country, where survival often depended on convincing potential threats that attacking would be more trouble than it was worth. "Lieutenant," Samuel said pleasantly, as if receiving unexpected military visitors was a normal part of his routine. "What brings you out to my spread so early in the morning?" Morrison dismounted with parade ground precision, his hand resting on his saber hilt in a gesture that was probably unconscious but clearly meant to establish authority. "We're tracking fugitive Apache who murdered white settlers 3 days ago. Reliable intelligence suggests they may have sought refuge in this area." "Apache fugitives?" Samuel kept his voice carefully neutral, neither helpful nor obstructive. "Can't say I've seen any Indians around here lately." "What kind of murders are we talking about?" "The worst kind," Morrison replied, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone who had told this story before and refined it with each telling. "Unprovoked attack on a peaceful hunting party. Man and his wife shot down in cold blood while their baby watched. Pure savagery." Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach as he recognized Morning Star's story, but twisted into something unrecognizable. In Morrison's version, she and her husband became the aggressors. Their hunting permit became evidence of premeditation, and their child became a witness to crimes they had never committed. "Terrible business," Samuel agreed, maintaining his careful neutrality. "Hope you catch whoever really did it." Morrison's eyes sharpened at the emphasis on really, recognizing a challenge to his authority, even if he couldn't quite identify its source. "We know exactly who did it, Mr. Garrett. The question is whether they're receiving assistance from misguided civilians who don't understand the danger they're placing themselves in." "Assistance how?" "Food, shelter, information about patrol routes," Morrison replied, stepping closer to the porch in a gesture clearly meant to be intimidating. "The kind of help that makes a person an accessory to murder under territorial law." Samuel absorbed this threat without changing expression, but his grip on the rifle shifted slightly. Not enough to constitute a hostile gesture, but sufficient to remind Morrison that he was dealing with someone who knew how to use the weapon he carried. "Well, Lieutenant, I appreciate the warning about dangerous fugitives," Samuel said. "I'll certainly keep my eyes open for anyone who looks like they might be planning to murder white settlers. Can I offer you and your men some coffee before you continue your search?" Morrison studied Samuel's face with the intensity of someone trying to read hidden meanings in casual conversation. "That's generous of you, Mr. Garrett, but we need to search your outbuildings before moving on. Just routine procedure when tracking hostiles in settled areas." "Of course," Samuel replied, as if this were the most reasonable request in the world. "Help yourselves. Though I should mention that my barn's got a temperamental mule who doesn't take kindly to strangers. Might want to make some noise when you go in. Let him know you're coming." It was a warning that could be taken two ways: practical advice about a dangerous animal, or a coded message to anyone hiding in the barn that discovery was imminent. Morrison clearly understood both interpretations, but short of accusing Samuel of harboring fugitives without evidence, There was little he could do except proceed with the search and hope his suspicions proved groundless. Samuel watched from his porch as the soldiers spread out to inspect his property with the thoroughness of men who understood that their reputations depended on not missing anything important. They searched the house first, moving through rooms that held only the memories of better times and the simple necessities of bachelor living. Finding nothing suspicious, they moved on to the smaller outbuildings, the tool shed, the chicken coop, the root cellar where Samuel stored winter provisions. The barn was last, and Samuel felt his chest tighten as Morrison approached the heavy wooden doors with the confidence of someone who expected to find exactly what he was looking for. The lieutenant paused at the entrance, listening carefully for any sound that might indicate human presence, then pushed open the door and stepped inside with his pistol drawn. The search seemed to last forever, though Samuel's pocket watch told him it was less than 10 minutes. He could hear the soldiers moving hay bales, checking stalls, prodding at shadows with their rifle barrels. Once, Morrison called for more light, and Samuel thought his heart might stop entirely as additional soldiers brought lanterns to illuminate the darker corners where someone might hide. Finally, Morrison emerged from a barn, his face showing frustration rather than triumph. "Nothing," he reported to his sergeant, loud enough for Samuel to hear. "Either they're not here, or they're better at hiding than we gave them credit for." "Could have moved on already," the sergeant suggested. 3 days is long enough to reach Mexico, if they know the country." Morrison nodded reluctantly. Clearly disappointed at not finding the fugitives, he was certain were hidden somewhere on Samuel's property. "Mount up," he ordered his men. "We'll check the Patterson place next." As the patrol prepared to leave, Morrison approached Samuel's porch one final time. "Mr. Garrett," he said formally, "I want to thank you for your cooperation with this investigation. And I want to remind you that harboring fugitives is a serious crime under territorial law." "I'll keep that in mind, Lieutenant," Samuel replied. "Hope you find who you're really looking for." Morrison's eyes flashed at the repeated implication that his search was misdirected, but he was intelligent enough to recognize that pressing the issue without evidence would only weaken his position. Instead, he touched his hat brim in a gesture that might have been courtesy or threat, then mounted his horse and led his patrol back toward the desert. Samuel remained on his porch until the soldiers disappeared over the horizon, then waited another hour before approaching the barn. When he finally opened the door, he found Morning Star and Little Fox exactly where he'd left them, but with hay arranged around them in patterns that suggested they had been completely buried during the search. "How?" Samuel asked, marveling at their complete invisibility. Morning Star smiled for the first time since he'd met her. "Apache children learn to hide before they learn to walk," she said simply. "And Apache mothers learn that their children's lives depend on being better at hiding than soldiers are at searching." As Samuel helped her brush hay from her hair and clothes, he realized that the morning's events had changed something fundamental about their situation. Morrison clearly suspected that Samuel was harboring the fugitives, which meant the ranch was now under unofficial surveillance. Any attempt to help Morning Star reach Mexico would have to account for watchers who would report suspicious activity to authorities looking for any excuse to arrest them all. But looking at Lil Fox, who had slept peacefully through the entire search, Samuel felt his resolve strengthen rather than weaken. Some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. And if Lieutenant Morrison wanted to fight over the right to shelter innocent people from injustice, then Samuel Garrett was prepared to give him one. For 3 days after Morrison's visit, Samuel maintained his normal routines while keeping careful watch for signs of surveillance. He worked a small herd, repaired fences, and made his weekly trip to town for supplies, all while acutely aware that unfriendly eyes might be recording his movements. But the desert seemed empty of watchers, and gradually Samuel began to believe that Morrison had moved his search elsewhere. Morning Star and Little Fox remained hidden in the barn during daylight hours, emerging only after full darkness to walk quietly around the ranch yard and breathe air that didn't smell of hay and horses. Samuel brought them food and water, but more importantly, he brought news from town, reports of other cavalry patrols, rumors about Apache movements, fragments of information that might help Morning Star plan her eventual journey to safety. On the 4th night, as Samuel shared his evening meal within the barn, Morning Star made a decision that would change everything. "I must leave tomorrow night," she announced quietly, little Fox sleeping in her arms. "The longer I stay, the more danger I bring to you. And my son needs to reach safety before winter makes travel impossible." Samuel had been expecting this moment, but hearing the words still hit him like a physical blow. In just a few days, Morning Star and her child had filled a void in his life that he hadn't even realized existed. Their presence had given his routines purpose beyond mere survival, had reminded him what it felt like to protect something more precious than property. "It's 300 miles to the border," Samuel said. "Most of it through country where Morrison's patrols are hunting specifically for you." "I know the risks," Morningstar replied, "but the risks of staying are greater. Morrison will return, and next time he may have Apache scouts with him. Trackers will find what his soldiers missed." Samuel absorbed this, understanding that she was right about the dangers, but unwilling to simply let her walk into the desert to face them alone. What if there was another way? What if he didn't have to run? "What do you mean?" Samuel had been thinking about this for days, weighing options and calculating costs, trying to find a path that led to justice rather than merely survival. What if we could prove that Morrison lied about what happened to your husband? What if we could show that you're innocent of the crimes he's accused you of? Morningstar shook her head sadly. Who would believe an Apache woman against a white officer? Who would listen to my testimony against his? "Maybe no one," Samuel admitted. "But Morrison's made enemies among his own people. Officers who think he's too ambitious, civilians who've seen how he operates. If we could find the right people, present the right evidence." "What evidence?" "My husband is dead. The other soldiers will say whatever Morrison tells them to say. There are no white witnesses to contradict his story." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, thinking about witnesses and evidence, about the kinds of proof that might convince even prejudiced judges that justice mattered more than racial solidarity. "Maybe there don't need to be white witnesses," he said finally. "Maybe Apache testimony is enough, if it comes from the right source." Before Morningstar could ask what he meant, they both heard it, a sound that made every muscle in Samuel's body tense with recognition and growing alarm. Hoofbeats again, but not the organized clatter of cavalry patrols. This was something else entirely. The rhythmic thunder of many unshod horses moving across hard ground. Samuel moved to the barn door, peering through a gap in the wooden planks toward the source of the approaching sound. What he saw made his blood run cold with wonder and something approaching awe. Warriors, not dozens, but hundreds, emerging from the desert darkness like flood water filling a basin. They rode with the fluid precision of men born to the saddle, their presence both magnificent and terrifying in ways Samuel struggled to comprehend. At their head rode a figure that commanded immediate respect, an older man whose bearing spoke of natural authority, whose scarred face told stories of battles fought and survived. The Apache forces arranged themselves in a great circle around the ranch, their horses stamping and snorting but maintaining perfect discipline. They faced a small cluster of buildings with patient attention, saying nothing, making no threatening gestures, simply waiting with the kind of stillness that spoke of predators who had all the time in the world. "Grandfather," Morningstar whispered, and Samuel heard both relief and fear in her voice. "Chief Running Bear," Samuel said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "He's come for you." "He has come to judge," Morningstar corrected, "to decide whether I am the murderer Morrison claims, or the innocent woman I know myself to be." Samuel felt the weight of the moment settling around him like the desert silence itself. Whatever happened next would determine not just Morningstar's fate, but his own, and possibly the future relationship between the Apache Nation and the white settlers who shared this harsh but beautiful land. "What do we do?" Samuel asked. "We face judgment," Morningstar replied, rising to her feet with Little Fox in her arms. "We tell the truth and trust that honor still means something in this world." As they prepared to emerge from the barn and face whatever Justice Chief Running Bear had brought with him across the desert, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 years. The sense that he was about to participate in events larger than his own life, that the choices he made in the next few minutes might echo across generations in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The desert night seemed to hold its breath as two very different concepts of justice, prepared to meet under stars that had witnessed countless such encounters between peoples who shared the same land but often seemed to inhabit different worlds. And in that charged silence, Samuel Garrett prepared to discover whether compassion could triumph over prejudice, whether truth could overcome the comfortable lies that allowed good people to ignore injustice when confronted would cost them more than they were willing to pay. Samuel and Morning Star emerged from the barn together. Little Fox sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms despite the tension that crackled through the night air like lightning before a storm. The circle of Apache warriors remained motionless on their horses, a living wall of judgment that surrounded the ranch buildings in perfect symmetry. In the center of this formation, Chief Running Bear sat his mount with the dignity of someone accustomed to making decisions that would affect the lives of generations. Samuel had expected immediate confrontation, demands for explanations, perhaps violence born from a father's grief over a daughter he believed had become a murderer. Instead, he found himself facing something far more unnerving: absolute silence, the kind of patient attention that suggested these men had ridden through the night not for revenge, but for truth. Chief Running Bear dismounted slowly, his movements carrying the weight of 70 winters and the authority of someone who had led his people through impossible times. He approached the small group with measured steps, his eyes moving between Samuel and Morning Star with the careful assessment of someone trying to understand not just what happened, but why. "My daughter," he said finally, his English accented but clear, "you have been gone for 7 days. 7 days during which I have heard many stories about what kind of woman you have become." Morning Star straightened, meeting her father's gaze directly despite the obvious strain of their circumstances. "And what kind of woman do these stories say I am, father?" "They say you are a killer of white settlers. They say your husband died trying to protect you from the justice you deserved. They say you fled rather than face the consequences of your crimes." Samuel could hear the pain beneath Running Bear's formal words, the grief of a father forced to believe terrible things about a child he had raised to honor the old ways of justice and mercy. "And do you believe these stories?" Morning Star asked quietly. Running Bear's expression didn't change, but Samuel caught something in his eyes, doubt perhaps, or hope that the stories might be false. "I believe that Lieutenant Morrison has no reason to lie about such things. I believe that white law must be respected if our peoples ought to live in peace, even when white law serves white lies." Samuel found himself asking, surprised by his own boldness in addressing the chief directly. Running Bear's attention shifted to Samuel, studying him with the intensity of someone trying to read character in the lines of a stranger's face. "You speak boldly for a man who harbors accused murderers on his land." "I speak honestly for a man who's seen enough of Lieutenant Morrison's version of justice to know the difference between law and lawlessness," Samuel replied. "Your daughter isn't a murderer, Chief. She's a mother trying to protect her child from men who killed her husband for sport. These are serious accusations you make against a United States officer. They're serious crimes he committed against your people," Samuel countered. "The question is whether you're willing to hear the truth or whether you'd rather believe comfortable lies that let Morrison get away with murder." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft sounds of horses shifting in the darkness and the distant call of a night bird hunting across the desert. Samuel could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, understanding that he had just challenged one of the most powerful Apache leaders to choose between the version of events that preserved peace with white authorities and the version that demanded justice for his own people. "Speak," Running Bear said finally, addressing Morning Star. "Tell me what really happened in the high country." Morning Star's account was detailed and devastating, delivered in the measured tones of someone who understood that her life, and her child's life, depended on every word being believed. She described a legal hunting permit, the peaceful camp, Morrison's sudden arrival with accusations of cattle theft and murder. She told of her husband's attempt to show his papers, of Morrison's immediate violence, of the lies told to cover up an unprovoked killing. When she finished, the silence stretched again, but this time Samuel could feel something different in it, not just judgment, but recognition, the kind of understanding that comes when truth aligns with what people already suspect but haven't been willing to acknowledge. "These are grave accusations," Running Bear said finally, "but accusations require proof if they are to become justice." "I have proof," Samuel said, reaching into his jacket for the folded papers he'd been carrying since Morning Star's arrival. "The hunting permit your son-in-law carried, signed by the territorial Indian agent. countersigned by the post commander at Fort Bayard. Legal authorization to hunt elk in the high country during the authorized season. Running Bear examined the documents carefully, his weathered face showing no emotion as he read the official stamps and signatures that proved Morning Star's version of events. Morrison claimed these were forgeries. Morrison claims a lot of things that turn out to be convenient lies, Samuel replied. But paper doesn't lie, and signatures don't change their meaning just because an ambitious officer finds them inconvenient. Chief Running Bear folded the papers carefully, returning them to Samuel with a nod that might have been approval. Then he did something that surprised everyone present. He walked to where Morning Star stood with Little Fox and gently took his grandson into his arms. "I have been a fool," Running Bear said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the desert silence. "I allowed white man's poison to cloud my judgment of my own blood. I believed lies because believing them was easier than facing the truth about what our friendship with the United States government has cost us." He turned to address his warriors, speaking in rapid Apache that Samuel couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear from the responses it generated. The mounted men began to move, not dispersing but repositioning themselves in patterns that suggested preparation for action rather than departure. "What's happening?" Samuel asked. "Justice," Running Bear replied, switching back to English. "My daughter speaks the truth about Lieutenant Morrison's crimes. Now it is time for those crimes to be answered." Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach as he understood what the chief was planning. "You're going to war over this. I am going to demand that Morrison face Apache justice for the murder of my son-in-law," Running Bear corrected. "If white law will not hold him accountable, then Apache law will. That will mean war with the territorial government. They'll send the entire army after you." "Perhaps," Running Bear acknowledged. "But some things are more important than peace purchased with the blood of innocents. Some truths are worth fighting for, regardless of the cost." As Samuel watched the Apache warrior prepare for what might be their final battle, he realized that his simple act of compassion toward a desperate mother had set in motion forces that could reshape the relationship between two peoples who had learned to see each other as enemies. The choices he made in the next few hours might determine whether that relationship moved toward justice or exploded into violence that would consume everything he had tried to protect. But looking at Little Fox sleeping peacefully in his grandfather's arms, Samuel felt his resolve strengthen rather than weaken. Some battles were worth fighting. Some truths were worth defending, and some acts of decency created obligations that reached deeper than law or politics or the careful calculations of survival. Tomorrow would bring challenges he couldn't yet imagine, but tonight, under a sky full of stars that seemed to approve of justice finally being demanded, Samuel Garrett prepared to discover what price honor required and whether he was man enough to pay.